I'm Deborah. Standing in my living room, I watched as two police officers entered, their expressions serious and professional. My parents, looking shocked and bewildered, stood nearby, their carefully laid plans in tatters. It all started earlier that fateful Tuesday morning. The knocking on my door at 7 a.m. was sharp and insistent. I was in the middle of making my morning coffee and going through some work reports when the sound cut through the peaceful morning like a thunderclap. 3 quick raps, a pause, and then 3 more. I recognized this pattern immediately. It was my father's way of demanding my attention, a habit he'd had since I was a child. I set down my coffee mug and walked towards the door, already dreading the conversation that was about to unfold. Peering through the peephole, I saw my parents standing in the hallway. My father, Mr. Thompson, a former corporate executive known for his strict and authoritative demeanor, had a red-faced look of indignation. My mother, Mrs. Thompson, a retired accountant, was clutching a folder to her chest as if it were a shield. "Deborah, open this door right now." My father's voice boomed through the door. "We need to talk." I unlocked the deadbolt and opened the door to find them both dressed as if they were going to a high-stakes business meeting. My father wore his expensive charcoal gray suit, the one he reserved for important corporate events. My mother was in a black business dress, complete with a string of pearls and a stern expression that could make anyone nervous. "Good morning," I said, stepping aside to let them in. "Coffee?" "We're not here for small talk," my father replied, striding into my living room as if he owned the place. My mother followed closely behind, folder in hand. "This is about your living situation and our family's financial future," my father declared in a formal tone that immediately set off alarm bells in my head. Whenever my parents used this kind of business-like language, it usually meant they'd made decisions about my life without consulting me and were about to present a well-thought-out argument to justify their choices. "I think my living situation is fine," I said, closing the door and following them into the living room. "Rent is paid, utilities are up to date, and my neighbors are quiet." "That's precisely the problem," my father said, positioning himself in the center of the room, his posture exuding authority. "At 32 years old, you should be working towards homeownership, building equity, and planning for your future." My mother opened the folder and pulled out what looked like a real estate listing. "We found you a wonderful 2-bedroom apartment in Greenfield Estates. The mortgage payment would be less than what you're paying in rent here, and you'd be building wealth instead of throwing money away." The listing was professional, with color photos and detailed specifications. It was clear they had spent a lot of time researching and preparing this presentation. "I like living here," I said simply. "Liking something isn't the same as making smart financial decisions," my father retorted, his voice full of the condescension he'd developed over years of leading corporate teams. "Your mother and I have watched you waste money on rent for 9 years. Do you have any idea how much equity you could have built by now?" My mother consulted her folder as if it were a holy book. "We calculated that you've paid approximately $108,000 in rent since you moved out. That money could have been used to build real wealth through property ownership. The rental market in this area has also become unstable," my father continued, pacing around my living room like a detective on a case. "Rent increases, gentrification, building conversions. You could be forced to move at any time." "Where would you go then?" "Probably to another apartment," I said, refilling my coffee cup. "Would you like some breakfast?" "I have muffins." "Deborah, you're not taking this seriously," my mother said, her voice full of the frustration she'd felt when I'd chosen an art-related career over a more practical one. "We're trying to help you build a stable future." "I have a stable future," I replied. "Living in someone else's building, at the mercy of their decisions about rent and maintenance? That's not stability, that's dependency," my father said, shaking his head in disappointment. He walked to the window and looked out at the charming street below. "This area is nice, but you're paying top dollar for someone else's investment. The building owner is getting rich off your rent while you have nothing to show for it." I had to suppress a smile at the irony of his statement, but I knew from past experience that correcting my parents' assumptions would only lead to a longer and more heated argument. The apartment we found has everything you need, my mother said, pulling out more paperwork. 2 bedrooms, 1.5 bathrooms, a modern kitchen, and in-unit laundry. And the HOA fee covers maintenance and security. It's only a 20-minute drive from here, my father added. You could keep your current routine while building equity and putting down roots in the community. Their research was thorough, and their arguments were logical, based on the conventional wisdom about real estate investment that financial experts had been preaching for years. I appreciate the research, but I'm not interested in moving, I said firmly. Not interested or afraid of the commitment? My father challenged, his voice sharp like a blade. Homeownership requires responsibility and long-term thinking. Maybe that's what's holding you back. The accusation of immaturity was a familiar one. It was part of a long-standing family narrative about my supposed reluctance to embrace adult responsibilities. Or maybe you've gotten too comfortable with the easy option, my mother added, her voice softer but still carrying the same underlying message. Renting is simpler because you don't have to worry about maintenance or property taxes. But simple isn't always better. I sat down on the couch and listened as they outlined their vision of my future, complete with mortgage payments, property tax schedules, and home equity loans. They had thought through every detail of a life they believed I should want, without ever asking me what I actually wanted. The seller is motivated, my mother continued, consulting her notes. They've moved to another city for a job, so they're open to reasonable offers and flexible closing dates. We could co-sign the mortgage if your credit score needs improvement, my father offered. Help you get better interest rates until your financial situation stabilizes. I knew that this offer of financial assistance came with strings attached, including their ongoing oversight of my spending and lifestyle choices. I don't need help with my credit score, I said. Everyone can use help with something, my father replied, his tone suggesting that he knew what was best for me. The important thing is to take action before you get stuck in a cycle of renting forever. My mother pulled out what looked like a timeline, with deadlines for mortgage applications, home inspections, and closing procedures. If we act quickly, you could be in your new place by the end of next month. The assumption that I would readily agree to their plan was typical of how my parents approached major decisions in my life. They identified problems, researched solutions, and presented their conclusions as if my agreement was a given. I'm not buying an apartment, I said, my voice firm. This statement hung in the air like a challenge to everything they had spent weeks planning. My father's expression shifted from disappointment to frustration and then to a principled anger, the same look he gave to employees who didn't follow his instructions. Deborah, sometimes you have to make decisions based on logic, not emotion, he said, his voice full of the patience of someone explaining basic concepts to a child. We've done the research, crunched the numbers, and found the best option. You can't just ignore good advice because it requires change. I can ignore advice I don't want, I retorted. It's not about what you want, it's about what you need, my mother said, her voice sharp with frustration. You need to start building wealth, establishing roots, and stop wasting money on rent. What I need is for you to respect my choices about where I live, I said. The conversation had reached that familiar point where their helpful suggestions turned into demands backed by family authority and emotional pressure. Your choices haven't been very wise so far, my father said, his voice final. 9 years of rent payments and nothing to show for it except a lease that could be terminated at any time. That's why we're intervening now, before you waste even more money on a lifestyle that doesn't build a future. The word intervening was telling. It showed that they saw my housing situation as a crisis that required family action, rather than a personal choice that deserved respect. I'm not wasting money, I'm paying for a place to live, I said. You're paying to make someone else rich, my father countered, walking around my apartment as if he were looking for evidence of my poor decision-making. Every month, you give a large check to a landlord who uses your money to build his own wealth. Do you even know who owns this building? Some investment company, probably, my mother said dismissively. Or a property management firm that treats tenants like numbers. Maybe a foreign investor who bought the property for tax reasons. Someone who doesn't care about the community or the tenants, just the money. The point is, my father continued, you're working to pay off someone else's mortgage instead of your own. After 9 years, you have nothing tangible to show for your payments. Except a place to live that I love in a neighborhood I enjoy, I replied. Enjoyment doesn't build wealth, my mother said. Security, ownership, and equity build wealth. She pulled out financial projections from her folder. If you'd bought property 9 years ago instead of renting, you'd have at least $50,000 in equity by now. Maybe more, depending on market appreciation. My parents had clearly put a lot of time and effort into building a financial argument for homeownership. And in another 9 years, you'd own the property outright instead of still paying rent with nothing to show for it, my father added. That's the difference between having a plan and just drifting through life. I have a plan, I said quietly. Continuing to rent isn't a plan, it's avoidance, my father said, his voice full of certainty. That's why we're here, to help you move from avoidance to action, from drifting to building something real. The conversation had evolved from a helpful suggestion to a full-blown family intervention. The apartment we found won't be available forever, my father warned. Real estate moves fast in desirable areas, especially for first-time buyers. If you wait too long, you'll miss this opportunity and end up paying more for something less appealing. I understood that they had done a lot of research, but I was still not interested in buying property. Not interested or not ready to take on adult responsibility? My father challenged. My mother spoke more gently, maybe not ready. It's understandable, but you can't avoid it forever. Homeownership is intimidating at first, but it becomes manageable once you commit. I appreciated their concern, but I was happy with my current situation. Happiness isn't enough, my father said firmly. You need security and a future. What if something happens to your income? If you own property, you have equity to fall back on. If you're renting, you have nothing. The scenarios they painted were indeed concerning, based on economic uncertainties and their own experiences with financial setbacks. Or what if the building owner decides to sell, convert to condos, or raise the rent beyond what you can afford? You'd have to move on their terms, maybe to a neighborhood you don't like, my mother added. But their entire analysis was based on incorrect assumptions about my situation. Actually, I said, standing up and walking to my desk, I do have housing security. I pulled out a folder from my desk drawer, filled with official and legally binding documents. What kind of security? My father asked, his voice skeptical. The kind that comes with owning the building, I said. My parents looked at me in disbelief, as if I'd just said something impossible. What do you mean, owning the building? My mother asked slowly. I opened the folder and showed them the deed, property tax records, and mortgage documentation that proved I owned the 4-story building we were in. I bought this building 4 years ago through a real estate investment company, I said, handing them the deed. I'm not paying rent to a landlord, I'm paying myself. My father took the document with unsteady hands and scanned the legal language. This is impossible, he whispered. You work at an art gallery. Your salary isn't enough to buy a building like this. My gallery salary covers my living expenses, I explained. The building generates rental income from the other units that more than covers the mortgage, taxes, and maintenance. My mother was studying the property tax records. Deborah, this building is worth. It's assessed at $1.5 million. The market value is probably closer to $2 million now. Real estate has appreciated well in this neighborhood over the past few years, I said matter-of-factly. The numbers hit them like a punch in the gut, shattering their assumptions about my financial situation. Where did you get the money for the down payment? My father asked, trying to piece together the facts. I saved it from my previous job in finance before I decided to pursue my passion in art, I said. I retrieved my old business cards from my previous finance jobs, showing them that I had worked in investment banking and then private equity for 7 years after college. I saved most of my salary and bonuses because I knew I wanted to do something more meaningful with my life eventually. My mother was mesmerized by the business cards, evidence of a career and financial resources she had never known about. But you never mentioned this. We had no idea. You never asked about my work history. You just assumed I was struggling because I chose a lower-paying job in the arts, I said. If you own this building, why do you live so simply? My mother asked. Why don't you have a fancy car or expensive furniture? Because I don't need those things to be happy. And keeping my expenses low maximizes the passive income from the building, I replied. The concept of choosing simplicity despite having resources was foreign to them. But people will think. Your lifestyle suggests. My mother struggled to articulate her concerns about social status. Why didn't you tell us? My father asked finally. Why let us worry about your financial future if you're actually wealthy? Because every time I tried to tell you I was fine, you thought I was in denial or being immature, I said, gesturing towards my mother's folder full of apartment listings. Just then, my father's phone rang. He looked at the caller ID with a grimace. It's your Uncle Carl. He's probably calling about the eviction notice. What eviction notice? I asked. My parents exchanged a guilty look. Well, my father said slowly, we may have been a bit more proactive in getting you to make this change. My mother opened the folder and pulled out an official-looking eviction notice. We had Carl draft this, just in case you were resistant to moving. I scanned the notice, which stated that I had to vacate the premises within 24 hours due to a building sale and lease termination. It's not real, my father said quickly. Carl just made it look official to add some pressure to your decision-making. You created fake legal documents to force me out of my apartment? I asked, shocked at their presumption. We thought a little pressure might help you make a positive change, my mother explained, her voice defensive. And if that didn't work, what were you going to do? I asked. Call the police, my father admitted. Carl said eviction enforcement requires law enforcement. I pulled out my phone. Well, let's call them right now. Deborah, that's not necessary, my mother said quickly. We can work this out as a family. You created fake legal documents and threatened police involvement. I think it's very necessary, I said, dialing 911. The 20 minutes we spent waiting for the police were incredibly uncomfortable. My mother kept looking at her folder as if it could solve the problem, and my father paced around the living room, his carefully planned intervention completely out of control. When the police officers arrived, they entered with a professional wariness. Someone called about a landlord-tenant issue? Officer Johnson asked, looking at the three of us. Yes, I said, handing him my phone with the property deed displayed. These people are trying to evict me from my own building using fake legal documents. Officer Johnson studied my phone screen and then looked at my father. Sir, you need to step away from the property owner immediately. My father quickly said, there's been a misunderstanding. We're her parents. We were trying to help her make better housing decisions. Officer Johnson's partner, Officer Lee, examined the eviction notice with skepticism. This document claims legal authority it doesn't have. That's fraud. We didn't mean for it to be taken seriously, my mother said, her voice small. We just wanted to encourage her to consider homeownership. Ma'am, creating false legal documents is a criminal offense, regardless of your intentions, Officer Johnson explained. And using fraudulent paperwork to force someone out of their home is harassment and potentially criminal coercion. The officers asked if I wanted to press charges. I looked at my parents, who were clearly in shock and starting to understand the severity of their actions. Not this time, but I want you to know that any future attempts to interfere with my housing situation will result in criminal charges and restraining orders. The officers told my parents to leave the property immediately and not return without my invitation. My father turned back at the door and said, "Deborah, we really were trying to help. We thought you needed guidance. What I needed was for you to ask about my actual situation instead of making assumptions," I replied. My mother added, "We had no idea about your financial resources. You live so simply, we thought you were struggling." Living simply when you have resources is called financial discipline. It's how you build real wealth, I said. After they left, I sat in my living room, sipping my coffee and looking at the property documents. The building was quiet, except for the normal sounds of my